Just give it a few more minutes for the live stream to get all synced up so that we don't lose the YouTube crowd, and then we'll get going. All right, looks like we are live, so I will go ahead and kick us off. So thank you all so much for joining us for this webinar on sharing government data with the public. I'm joined here by Stephanie Strauss and Amy O'Hara from Georgetown's Massive Data Institute, and Stefaan Verhulst from the GovLab. And so with that, I will go ahead and we're going to kick it off with a little bit of a presentation, and then we'll move to a panel style Q&A. So here we go. All right, so as I noted, you are in the webinar on effectively sharing government data with the public. We'll be talking about the benefits of doing so, some of the challenges, and some best practices to make that go smoothly. So the agenda today here, like I said, we've done some introductions. I'll pop up a slide so you can see our names all written out. Also, I always do this when I'm introducing myself. I forgot myself. I'm Quay-de, I'm one of the technologists here at CDT. We will talk about why release data publicly, what's the benefit of doing so, some of the best practices and federal engagement going on around this topic, and then we'll talk a little bit about some guidance for public release. And then of course we'll have some Q&A time so you all can ask us your questions. Feel free to do that through the Q&A feature here on the Zoom, and our lovely folks will pass us along. If you are watching the YouTube, I believe you can tweet at us with the hashtag CDT questions. And with that, great. So as I mentioned, here are our lovely panelists. I'm popping this slide up so you can screenshot us if you want to find us later. We'll also have a slide at the end with emails so you can track us down. And with that, I will talk a little bit about why to release data publicly. What is the benefit here? So there's a number of benefits of releasing data publicly. And when we're talking about releasing data publicly, for the purposes of this, we're primarily talking about government data. So this is data that is largely in the hands of government agencies that they're collecting, that they're using, that might be more effective and add on to the efficacy if it is shared with the public. And there's a number of benefits that can come from that sharing. The first one is directly empowering individuals and the general public. This data might be useful for them in making decisions in their own lives. One example we see of this is school data that gets released that can help parents figure out, what districts they want to live in, how they want to manage their child's education. That data can also be used to support research on program efficacy. So a lot of governments do this. A lot of agencies do try to do this in-house. They analyze their programs for efficacy, but often the communities that are actually impacted by those programs can do that as well. So that's another, just adding more sort of brains into that process of trying to analyze the efficacy of government programs. Another advantage is it can support the work of adjacent organizations. So if you think about government organizations that are often working in tandem, right? So that's if you are, for instance, if you qualify for certain housing benefits, you may very well also qualify for food stamp style benefits. Sharing data out publicly, that sharing can happen directly between agencies. That can often be a pretty heavyweight process. So sharing data more publicly can help these other agencies have a sense of what data your agency has, and therefore how to build off of each other's data more effectively. Related to that, it can actually also reduce administrative burden in some ways. If you're already sharing data publicly, you don't have to necessarily go through these same heavyweight administrative processes to share that same data with other organizations or with researchers or what have you. And then finally, maybe this one's clear, but it can be a pretty good avenue for advancing government transparency. It really helps the general public understand what kind of data the government is collecting, what they're doing with it, all of that sort of thing. So it can be really effective on that front as well. And so just to put some of that in a more specific terms, I was just gonna give you all a quick case study just to get a sense of how this data can be used. So one case is climate resistance in the city of Norfolk, Virginia. Norfolk is, as you can tell from this picture, a city that's right there on the coast of Virginia, so very prone to feel the effects of climate change. the city developed an interface to allow researchers, external researchers, to access information about flood gauge data. So how prone to flooding certain neighborhoods may be, different parts of the city infrastructure that could be prone to that. Doing so opened up that data to a much broader range of researchers to more easily study this issue that's pretty, as I mentioned, a critical issue for a waterfront city. That means that these researchers don't have to go through the process of trying to develop agreements with the city to get that data. They can just access it much more easily, which for more research-strapped organizations can help them focus more effectively their resources on the research itself, instead of all of the work that can go in from trying to gather this data through more official agreements. Now, two of the organizations here, both CDT and the Massive Data Institute, have recently released some work around this. So I will pass it over to the Massive Data Institute folks, Stephanie and Amy, to talk about their work. And then once they've taken you through that, I'll talk a little bit about the report that CDT has put out. So Stephanie and Amy, off to you.
Thanks, Anna. Could I have the next slide, please? Hi, I'm Amy O'Hara. I work at the Massive Data Institute, and I'm going to continue unpacking these issues a bit more before I get into what the best practices are and what our report really was learning. So when you think about all of the data that's being generated right now, you're generating it as we sit here. We are generating data. So much of it could be potentially useful. And Hannah just walked through a number of examples of how it can be useful, especially when it's being generated by the federal, by state, by local government agencies. But we also acknowledge that it can be potentially risky too, because this is information that's about me or about my location or about my child. And it has to do with the attributes about me. So maybe not just my name or my social security number, but characteristics about me that could also be very sensitive. You could be looking at my information at a point in time or over my entire life course, potentially looking over decades and bridging back to my parents or my grandparents to look at mobility. You may also want to know where I've lived to think about what sort of environmental toxins that I may have been exposed to. So there's so many forms of sensitive information here, and we want to think about how that data needs to be protected. And it could be the information itself or the statistics that are being used when researchers gain access to this data. It could be tables of information, could be reports, it could be maps, it could be visualizations, but there's so many ways that we need to consider how the data need to be protected. Next slide. Thanks. So Stephanie and I think about this in terms of two types of privacy. There's input privacy and output privacy. So just unpacking this a bit more, my electronic health record or my educational transcript or my employment history, thinking of those alongside all of the other patients who have health records, all the other students that have transcripts, all of the other employees that have their employment history, that information needs to be protected. And those are data inputs. Those information streams are being held by certain data owners or data controllers. And we contrast that with output privacy. When someone gets access to those other pieces of raw information and they generate statistics. These could be descriptive statistics like what is the mean or the median. It could be regression coefficients. It could be looking at trends. It could be looking at aggregate data. It could even be production of open data sources that you would go to a portal and see lots of that information. We want to be mindful of how these different aspects of privacy matter and how you can look for the best practices to protect the information when you're sharing government data with the public. And by public there, it's not just the general public, but it's also researchers who need access to these sensitive streams of information so that they're able to conduct analyses or evaluations so that they can understand the impact of different programs or policies to look at the outcomes of the individuals affected over time. When we look at this, we think about data in terms of and protecting privacy in terms of tiered access, which means that you're calibrating control and access to the data depending on its sensitivity level or the risk of something bad happening. So that really ties back to who is using the data, what they're using it for, where they're accessing it, and what they're planning on producing. And so there are a lot of best practices to protect those types of privacy. Next slide. So what is protecting privacy right now? Well, unfortunately, from that first bullet, a lot of people don't trust anybody, so they sit on top of their data and they don't let anyone use it. We think of that as a data lockdown. So data are very highly protected, but they also are not being used for anything that can generate insights or evaluation or potential changes to make our society better. There are also a number of data controllers, especially among government agencies, that are using trusted third parties or contracts or data licenses. That is how they have defined limited trust relationships so that people can gain access to that very sensitive data for specific purposes. So those are how people are handling the input privacy. Who has access to my transcript? Who has access to my health information? That's kind of how that's happening. But in terms of output privacy, most organizations are using what we think of as traditional statistical disclosure limitations. And that's a mouthful, but what we mean here is when you're making statistics, you don't necessarily release the exact precise statistic. You create aggregate statistics. You might round to the nearest $100 or the nearest $1,000. If you want to protect certain unique outliers in the data, you might swap different households so that it's clear that it's less clear who these very unique people or households are. And another way that people protect privacy is through suppression. If you've ever looked at a report or a table and you see the little asterisk, and that's where they were unable to release the information because it was referring to a group that was too small or a group that was too unique, that is using suppression to protect privacy there. And with the work that Stephanie and I have been doing is saying, how do we move beyond these 4 bullets? How do you take where we are today and build upon that by using more modern techniques to protect privacy while still improving data access and while improving the openness of data? So Stephanie's going to tell you a bit more about our project and what we learned, particularly with our education use case.
Thanks, Amy. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, you have it already. Thank you. I'm Stephanie Strauss. I'm a policy fellow at the Massive Data Institute at Georgetown University. And as Hannah and Amy have just spoken about, this report here dovetails really nicely into the best practices that both of our teams have outlined for making government and institutional data more publicly available. And by publicly available, that means to individuals, can mean individuals sitting at home who want to know about the data, let's say from their students or their children's school district. It can mean a neighboring agency who can work with the existing agency to link their data and produce important research insights. And so all of these questions and these topics were investigated through this project. And this project was funded by the Gates Foundation. And last year, Amy and I conducted a landscape analysis of privacy preserving technologies in education. So that's the PPTs up at the top. And so we wanted to see for these modern techniques for data sharing and privacy protection of data within the education community, particularly in K-12 and higher ed institutions, are they using these advanced methodologies and techniques? What are they doing to protect their data? If they aren't using some of these PPTs, would they be open to it? If not, why not? What are the barriers? And so we conducted in the winter and spring of last year about 35 stakeholder interviews with education data intermediaries, researchers, and people from the academia world, state and local state education agency and education district employees, chief data officers, to ask them these questions. So it's the first effort, as far as we know of, to identify existing and abandoned PPT projects. We actually found quite a few, about 25. They're listed in our report. They've never been aggregated before. And it was really useful to see what's been done. I think for both Amy and I, we were pleasantly surprised to see that a lot more are being used. And these PPTs are being used in neighboring industries. A lot of what I'm about to say here doesn't apply just to education government agencies and institutions, but can be applied to other public policy issues, can apply to other government agencies. So within that, we also asked our interviewees, what are some of the barriers to adopting some of these privacy preserving technologies, increasing safe data sharing and increasing utility of your data. And we wanted to find entry points to implement some of these new methods. So what are some of the use cases, who is open to it and where, what would they need? And we identified some of these sort of most popular viable PPTs. I've listed some here, and those go along with the examples in our report, but just to call one out, trusted execution environment is also called a secure virtual enclave. And that's basically a secure virtual space in which authorized researchers or users, you don't have to be a researcher, you could be a journalist or a policymaker or a parent, can access that space. And that space is protected through encryption methods to look at the data, and the data cannot leave that space and the analysis cannot leave that space. And Washington State, their state education agency, which is called the Education Research Data Center, we found through our interviews and through this project actually have a trusted execution environment where they've de-identified or stripped away the identifying information of their students in their K-12 system, and they've linked it to higher education data as well. So parents, students, individuals, researchers, et cetera, can go in and look at some of the trends in enrollment and student outcomes. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what are the barriers that we found? We found a lot, and we found that they fell across these 4 buckets here. So I'm going to break each one of them down. The first set of barriers is legal in terms of increased data sharing and use of PPTs in these education data institutions. So some of them are actual legal barriers. The Federal Education Data Privacy Law, called FERPA, restricts the use of student data, protects student data and data subjects. And there are some use cases that run up against FERPA, as well as states have their own education data privacy laws on top of that. But what we found more often, interestingly, was perceived legal barriers. So in the education community, a lot of stakeholders we spoke to, just the threat of a potential FERPA violation and the consequences that have been made clear to them instilled this fear in them that sort of has been passed down through iterations of staff, and makes them not even want to try to push the envelope. And so something else that sort of makes that situation worse is there are not enough yes lawyers. We spoke to a chief data officer who had told us she has her yes lawyer. And what that means is not just a lawyer who says yes, but a lawyer who, if you want to do a new analysis that may require some new privacy preserving methodology, and instead of automatically saying no, FERPA doesn't cover that, our law doesn't cover that, someone who says, you know what, let's look into that and let's see if it actually could fit in, statutorily. And we've found that a lot of projects probably could, if those groups could try, and if they weren't told no immediately by lots of legal counsel. So those who have gone through and passed sort of the statute limitations, the data sharing agreements are another legal barrier that we heard resonating a lot with our interviewees. These can take years to produce. They can take years. Amy has experienced that personally when she was working at Census. They do take years. And we actually talked to someone who was about to, she works for local education district, and her office was about to create a data sharing agreement with several other surrounding districts. And then when leadership changed over, the DSAs fell apart. So that actually ties into the institutional barriers of the next slide. Some of them are political, based off of leadership and who's cycling through. Sometimes there's inertia, there's no demand for change. We heard a lot of, why would we fix something that isn't broken? We have enough to do, especially the state agency officials and at central offices within districts. They're resource strapped, they're staff strapped, they're funding strapped. So there's not a lot of incentive to do this, and there's lack of expertise, so they would need training, and there's no guidance from up above. A lot of them said, we don't even know where do we begin. We need some sort of national guidance. On the technical barriers, so we're listing here the barriers, but I want to add, a lot of these PPTs are ready for prime time and have been used for years across industries, finance, health, education, social services. But some of them still have untested use cases. For example, secure multi-party computation is really good for descriptive statistics. You want to get means, averages, etc. But if you want to do a complicated regression model, that is still being examined this moment by cryptographers and computer scientists here and abroad. And that they're also examining some of the slow compute times. And then as well as there's a skills gap. So as I mentioned before, under institutional, some of the staff would need training. So we heard a lot of these concerns echoing from our interviews. And for cultural, this sort of permeates all these other three barriers. A lack of PPT understanding. What is it? What is it? It sounds like AI. Sounds kind of scary in the education world. There's some stigma against it. Sorry, I'm almost done with this slide. Thank you.
Sorry, I was trying to click away and oops.
No problem. And so there's a lack of examples. You know, before the report that Amy and I put out, we had to just convene all of them together and write them up in one place, but we wouldn't have known about them if we didn't dig for them. So there's just this lack of awareness. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the recommendations that came out from our report, and a lot of these recommendations can be applied in general to government agencies, explain PPTs, or, you know, in this case for this webinar, explain what the data sharing, increased data access is and what you mean by it and what it will entail. Amy and I put on an event in the fall with a nonprofit called Dextera, where we gathered education data stakeholders and explained what PPTs were with examples and, you know, what they are and what they are not, how it's different from AI. We heard from people using them and, you know, partnering with national associations. There's education data technologists groups. There's chief superintendent groups in education. There's lots of conferences that happen around education research like AERA to get the word out. So the first step is awareness so people understand what they are and most importantly, why they're useful. The next bullet, engage champions and skeptics. So there are skeptics and that is understandable. It sounds, you know, computational and nerdy and complicated. And I am not a cryptographer, I'm not a computer scientist. So you know, getting people who can explain these and engage with both those who are for it and those who need more convincing and those who have concerns, all in the same room through task force, and to bring people on the ground, you know, get parents, you know, parents of students' data, get teachers in the room and talk about what these could do for their district, for their school, et cetera. Develop guidance and regulations. So that ideally would come from up above, in this case, federal parent agencies. So in our specific case, the Department of Education, to provide guidance for their state education agencies. And then below that, as you go down sort of the umbrella, the districts on what to do, like how they could incorporate some of these advanced methodologies into their existing state longitudinal data systems, which a lot of them did adopt. And, you know, the sort of pulpit status or the loudspeaker, megaphone, whatever you want to call it, that the Department of Education has is big, and we don't want to underestimate that. You know, we heard from a lot of interviewees that they would really like some standardized guidance from the top level that could even direct them where to go. Training at many levels. So that's not just the data scientist or data analyst within an organization or institution, also the IT staff, also working with, you know, any counselor or legal staff so they can understand how this fits in with their relevant statutes, having everyone understanding and on board. And also when turnover happens, to have not just one person who knows how to run the trusted execution environment. Invest in the science. That's a science with a capital S. That refers back a little bit to what I was saying with one of the technical barriers. A lot of these PPTs are very advanced and are open source, and some of them are ready, you know, for prime time, have been used, but could use a little bit more development, some of the nuances, depending on the use case for the research. And finally, fund to fill gaps. So all of the steps that and recommendations I just mentioned above require funding, and that's funding for all of this to provide training and staff time and the actual, you know, technology, as well as funding for example projects and pilots, so that, you know, the more that people see that it works, they might be willing to try it themselves. And with that, I'm going to pass it off back to Amy to talk about another report.
Thanks. Next slide. Actually, before I dig into this one, I want to answer the question that popped up in the Q&A that is about the specific legal concerns that we heard interviewees identify. Stephanie already mentioned that people are just afeared of FERPA. They were so worried that any sort of use of the learner data would result in a FERPA violation. So that's one thing. When we were talking to feds, they were concerned about compliance with Privacy Act. They were concerned with whether they would have to update their system of records notice or privacy impact assessments. And they were seemingly struggling with the use of these different methodologies to protect privacy as something new that would require these really big sea changes in their legal interpretation of their statute. But we were trying to explain, like, when you moved from having data in a file cabinet to having data on a server to having data with a cloud service provider, there were ways that you moved through that evolution of data storage. And this is the same thing, but it's the evolution of data access and the evolution of how you're doing data linkages and producing insights from the data. They seemed to understand it when we said that, but that didn't really win over the general counsel yet. So I do think that, as Stephanie said, that our recommendations are to continue that engagement to get people to understand what is involved with improving safe access to data. And now I'm going to hop to the content on this slide. In October, the Advisory Committee on Data for Evidence Building, also known as the Evidence FACA, released its Year 2 report. And I was a member of this advisory committee, and we worked for 24 months trying to determine what a national secure data service could do to improve the use of federal data for evidence building. Okay, so that's very wordy, but the gist of it was, how could you get better access to federal data to do data linkages, to do analyses, and to make sure that you're protecting privacy while you're doing all of that? So in year 1, the first 12 months, we came out with a report saying, yes, the United States should have a national secure data service. And then the following 12 months, we had to figure out what that national secure data service could do and should look like. And so in that report, there are many, many recommendations, but it talks about having a national secure data service that would have the core functions of enhancing coordination, communication, research and development, that capital S science like Stephanie was talking about, and also promoting data standardization, so that you would want to have a lot more interoperability to be able to get data from different agencies and to be able to connect them and use them so that they are available and reliable. And also you're doing that with privacy sensitivities and security. So that's a report that I would encourage you to look into, because it does have specific recommendations and sections that talk about privacy preserving technologies, but also have a ton of touch points to what Hannah had already outlined for us and what I hope she's going to be speaking about more in a minute. But there is a lot of federal activity right now, both with the continued implementation of the Evidence Act, as well as consideration of how OMB and the statistical system is going to move forward on some of the recommendations in this report. So with that, I hand it back to Hannah.
You really would think that after 2.5 years, but no. So I'm going to be pulling these recommendations from a report that CDT recently put out around sharing government data with the public, and we'll go ahead and drop a link to that in the chat. That report will also discusses some of the reasons for sharing data publicly that we talked about earlier, and some of the barriers that were covered really nicely here by Stephanie and Amy. But I'll be focusing primarily on some of the implementation guidance around what to do if you actually want, as an agency, want to release data publicly. So the report talks about several sort of overarching best practices that can help a public release of data go successfully. And I'll be focusing primarily on the more of the like policy side recommendations, although the paper does, the CDT paper does dig into some of the technical considerations there as well. And so I'll talk a bit more about each of these in depth, but just to give you an overarching view, we'll talk about establishing data governance processes and roles, engaging the external communities, both whose data will be used and whose are likely to make use of the released data, ensuring responsible use and privacy protection, which again is something that Stephanie and Amy have covered really nicely, and then how to go about evaluating resource constraints when doing this thing that can be a little bit resource heavy. So looking at the first one, they're around the data governance processes and roles. So the first step in thinking about how to go about releasing data is figuring out kind of how you're going to build a framework around that to do that in an ethical and responsible way. So having a clear decision-making process can help make sure that nothing sort of gets dropped along the process, right? If you know who is responsible for decisions, where the buck stops, that sort of thing, that can help make sure that all of the decisions are fully considered and everybody who's in the room who needs to be in the room is there. Again, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the discussion of resources, but figuring out which data to prioritize for public release is going to be a really important consideration for a number of reasons. The first one is a technical one, which is that different kinds of data is going to need different kinds of protection, right? So having a clear sense of what sort of data you're going to be releasing and who the intended audience is can help you make sure that data is protected. Another reason is a little bit more of a political one, but another part of a successful release is that is actually made use of, and that's particularly true when we're sort of in this early period of trying to make this a bit more of a norm. So figuring out what data is going to be most helpful to the public and most likely to be made use of is part of that consideration as well. And that just sort of makes sure you're putting your resources behind something that's actually going to be effective and is going to be made use of by the community. The other part of that, of course, is having a publishing and outreach strategy, right? Like I'm sure we all, both as administrators and advocates, have had the experience of releasing something in a way that sort of feels like you're talking into a void. So having a strategy for making sure that the data that you're releasing is going to get to the people who can make the best use of it, and how to make sure that those people are informed, and how do you make sure that they are supported, right? Like if you release data, you can do everything right, and you can still have somebody who has a question or is like, oh, this data is great, and if you could just give me this one other thing, I could do X, Y, and Z thing. So having an outreach strategy to figure out, how to get in touch with the right people, how to make sure that they're informed and they're supported in the process of using this data. And then, of course, another part of that is updating and maintaining the data after it's been released, right? These governance process and roles are part of the release, but they are also part of the existence of the data out in the world, right? So making sure both that the data is maintained, that it's accurate, and we'll get into this a bit later, but there's also an ongoing privacy consideration, right? One of the concerns often about data is around re-identification, right? So if you release a data set that is quite private, but then another data set is released that allows you to make certain connections in this original private seeming data, how do you go about kind of pulling that back and adjusting your needs? So continuing to be aware of the landscape your data exists in, updating it, maintaining it, all of that kind of good jazz. So just general good data stewardship, things that I think come as no surprise, but can be exceptionally important when the data is released publicly. Another very important best practice that we discussed a little bit is engaging these external communities, right? And this is, again, something that Amy and Stephanie talked about in quite a bit of depth, especially in that initial survey process. But figuring out how do you make sure that this data is both used in a way that aligns with the expectations of the people who are in your data set, often called the data subjects, And also, how do you engage the audiences that will be using it? That first step, these are often overlapping groups. They're often similar groups, but not always. And it's very unlikely that the Venn diagram of people represented in the data and people using the data is an exact perfect circle. So being aware of both of those groups and handling them effectively is going to be important. For communities represented in the data, aligning with expectations, right? If you collected the data originally for driver's licenses or whatever, and then you plan to repurpose it for like a climate study, right? So you want to know how many people are living in a floodplain. That is maybe not going to be upsetting to people, but it might be surprising to people, right? So doing this sort of engagement to figure out like, okay, we're taking this data in a new direction. Let's talk to some of the people who have given us their data so you can just kind of get a feel for how they're going to feel about that. Are there surprises that we're not going to see, right? Oftentimes there are cultural factors that can go into this sort of thing. And so engaging with the communities represented in the data is a pretty critical part of making sure you're not going to step on a live wire you didn't know was there. Now, as far as engaging audiences that will use the data, that one is often much more on the efficacy side, right? How do you make sure that the data that you're putting out is actually going to answer some of the questions that that community might have, right? Often researchers may have a really clear-cut idea. Academic researchers, folks with a training in research, may have a pretty clear-cut idea of what data they need. Community organizations that don't have that same background, it may be more useful to do a more in-depth engagement where you're engaging in a back and forth process to figure out like what questions do they want answered. And then from there, how do you work together to figure out what data is actually going to be able to answer those questions? And is there a way to release that data safely? And then, as we discussed above, a really critical component is that outreach upon publication, right? How do you get the data into the right hands? How do you support folks once they have the data? And that can range everything from like, we found a surprise privacy hole that you didn't catch, and so how do we fix it? Down to really ticky-tacky stuff of like, your Excel file doesn't open on my computer, right? So having a really robust process for folks to get back in touch with you as the releaser of the data as well. This one I won't spend a ton of time on because, again, Amy and Stephanie did cover it very robustly, and this is sort of one of the foundational elements of the privacy preserving or privacy protecting technologies that they were talking about, those PPTs, is how do you ensure responsible use and privacy protection? So privacy protection, a lot of that is around individual privacy, right? If you're releasing anonymized data set or aggregated data, how do you do so in a way that is not then tracebackable to individual people? How do you protect the privacy of individual people? Another factor is how do you avoid exacerbating bias and inequities? And this can be related to privacy, but isn't always. And so some of the things that the ways that data can exhibit bias and inequity oftentimes are historical and are built into the data itself. So upon release, it's really important to think about how to both be clear about what your data actually says and how to read it correctly, but also how to try to mitigate those biases. Sometimes those biases are just, there's less data about marginalized communities, right? Or as Stephanie and Amy mentioned, oftentimes the way that data is managed is through the suppression, right? And so oftentimes you're suppressing small community numbers because they're easier to re-identify, which is an important privacy element, but it does mean that you're then not reporting out data about those same marginalized communities. So in the process of release, thinking about what are the places that bias and inequity are showing up in the data, and just given the nature of bias and inequity in our world, it's a good chance it's in your data somewhere. So figuring out where that is and being quite clear about that and trying to figure out how to address that at the outset. And that sort of goes into understanding and having a good sense and engagement with the community so you know how data is being used, because these things can pop up in surprising ways. So relationships with folks using the data can help draw some of those things out. And then the final thing I'll talk about is how do you evaluate some of these resource constraints? And again, this is some of the work that Amy and Stephanie did talk about. There are these kind of broad range of resource constraints, right? You have financial constraints. Doing these things does require you to spend time on it. Often it requires some sort of money just for equipment even. There's technical considerations. What do you have available to you? If you don't have a public-facing server already, that's an additional cost, right? If you do have that already, then that's something that you can maybe leverage for this new process. So there is sort of an evaluation of taking in what resources do you actually have available to you already, and how can they be repurposed in this way? That personnel consideration is, I think, another really critical one that is easy to kind of overlook, especially in agencies where people tend to pick up work and kind of support each other ad hoc way. It can be easy to lose track of certain roles that need to be part of a public data release. Obviously, the technical component is a really critical one. You absolutely, especially if you are using a technical approach to privacy preservation, you need to have somebody who understands that. That's especially true for some of the newer ones that Amy and Stephanie mentioned. You know, things like multi-party computation can be pretty complicated, right? So having somebody, whether that's an employee or a consultant, who really understands that and can make sure that it's playing nice with your specific data. Another part of that personnel component is, again, those community relationships, right? How do you have the people who can be plugged into the community? Is there somebody who's tasked with community relationships, right? You don't want any one of these roles to be kind of a like, oh, anyone can pick it up, don't worry, it'll get handled. Like, it may be the case that lots of people can pick it up, but you usually need a like final point person of like, okay, it's been 2 days and no one's picked this up. So like, Jane, you're up, let's do it. So just making sure that you have really clear roles, really clear expectations about how the sort of personnel part of the data release process is going to go. So that's an overview of the best practices that are in CDT's report. As I mentioned, there's also a technical appendix in there, which I won't get into this talk, but I will share my email at the end of this talk. And if you want to email me questions about privacy preserving technologies, I almost certainly want to talk to you about them. So if you read the report and those pop up, feel free to let us know. But I think from there, I'm going to take us over to questions. So I'm going to end this slideshow so you can see all of our faces. I can kick us off with a few questions. Whoops, that was the wrong button. Sorry, folks. I'm going to kick us off with a few questions for the panelists, and please all drop your questions in the chat or share them with us on Twitter. So I'll kick us off by Stefaan. You've been in the background listening us talk to something about listening to us talk about something you're very familiar with. So I'll kick it off to you. You worked on public data projects in a really wide range of contexts spanning across different countries. In your experience, what are some of the universal elements that are necessary for a successful public data project, however you define that?
Right, great. And thanks, Hannah, and thanks, Stephanie and Amy, for this wonderful introduction, and congratulations on a great contribution to the literature on public data. And before I answer your question, I think it's important to set the stage that we're really talking about reuse of data that was collected for one purpose and using it for another purpose, right? And that's the opportunity. At the same time, it's the headache because we haven't really, as a society, figured out how to do this well. And there are a few, of course, conditions that contribute to do it better. And some of them you already listed, including the advance of new technologies. And I think it's important to take that into account because quite often, frankly, the discussion about reuse as if nothing has happened in the technology space and as if we can't actually deal with some of the challenges that have been listed earlier through other means. But the work that we have done is really looking into how can we make reuse more from public data, but also other data sets, including privately held data. How can we the reuse more systematic, sustainable, and responsible? Because that's really the challenge in the reuse of data, including the reuse of public data. There's no shortage of pilots here and there, but then when it really needs to become more systematic and sustainable and responsible, then we really need to figure out how we do this in a more professional way. And anyway, there are multiple areas and conditions, and some of you might know that we actually developed a periodic table with all the elements that we have identified that contribute to the success of certain kinds of unlocking data efforts. And I'm not going to go to the whole periodic table, but I'm just going to list 5, perhaps, Hannah, that might be important. And the first one is really to have a strong demand for the data, or a strong value proposition. Too often, a lot of the data projects that we see are still based upon, if you build it, will they come, right? Hoping that actually by just making data available, that it will be used. And more importantly, requesting data without actually a clear specification on how it will be used, for what purpose, and what will be the value when actually unlocked. And so spending time on formulating the demand is actually a really important ingredient for success. And if we skip that, then quite often we don't create that level of trust, we don't create the level of systematic use, and frankly, we lose the trust by the public on why the data has been used in the first place. And so spending time on the demand, and of course, given the fact that we are talking about data, that means that we actually also have to spend time on formulating the questions that matter for which we need the data. And as a society, it turns out we are actually really poorly organized for formulating questions. And more importantly, we are poorly organized to prioritize the questions for which we need data for, which is why, to a large extent, actually, I always point to the Evidence Act as actually a progress. And it would be interesting to hear, Amy, what you feel on the progress made with regard to, for instance, developing learning agendas within the US government that really specifies the demand for which data is needed, right? A learning agenda is where every agency has to actually specify what is it, what kind of question do they want to have answered, and for which they need data. And I think that's a huge progress. And I think I always use it to other countries as an example on how they should process in actually developing the demand before you actually start thinking about providing access to data. Now, once you have the demand, then of course you need to identify the data for which the question needs to be, can be answered with. And then it's really about what I call professionalizing the supply side, by which I mean is that we actually need a new profession within the supply side that can respond to the request for data. At the moment, one of the biggest, and I think it's right that Stephanie said that one of the biggest transaction costs is actually those data sharing agreements, and we have a lot of those, anyway, say no or say yes kind of lawyers. And by the way, meaning it will be interesting to see how that evolves based upon experience on how open source evolved, for instance, because in the past, IP lawyers were also say no lawyers, but that has changed in the open source environment. And so perhaps we can point to that on how it might evolve in the data sharing environment. But in addition to data sharing agreements, one of the biggest transaction costs is actually identifying the person who stewards the data that you need access to. And absent that kind of data steward, it's very hard to unlock data, very hard to know what's the quality of the data, very hard to know what's the context in which the data was collected, for which it then subsequently can reuse, and so on. And so if we, in addition to strengthening the demand, we could actually establish the profession of data stewards, I think that would be a big advance. And it turns out is a condition for success, because it's not just about exchanging data, it's actually really about negotiating between parties on what the data will be used for and who has actually the authority to release the data as well. And I think that's quite often what breaks. Third element, and I go very quickly, Hannah, because I don't want to take all the time and we are short on time already. But then it's really about, anyway, making sure that you match demand and supply in a responsible way, right? And again, I'm not going to go into detail because Stephanie and Amy and yourself, Hannah, have explained a lot on how you can go about that. And I like the output-input kind of privacy, and it dovetails a lot with actually what we try to advance, which is really trying to think through what is the challenges and the opportunities to protect and prevent misuse across the data lifecycle, right? because it's not just, anyway, you're talking about sharing, but if the data was collected in an appropriate way, then you will actually also have challenges down the line as well. And so it's really a data lifecycle approach that we need to take. And we need to also look into governance structures that are legitimate. And so we need to think about what determines legitimacy as it relates to governing those data structures. And that includes, of course, participation, it includes accountability, but it also includes transparency on how decisions are made so that ultimately the public trusts it. Which leads me to my fourth point very quickly, which is that we actually need a new social license for reusing data as well. And so you mentioned outreach to the public as well, Hannah. We put that under the broader rubric of establishing the social license for reuse of public data. Because while there was consent quite often in how the data was collected, it's very dodgy to determine whether there was also consent for reuse for other purposes as defined, which means that we actually need to go the extra mile and have a conversation with the public at large on what do they feel should be the conditions, or what do they feel comfortable with regard to how this data is being used. And we developed something called the Data Assembly, which is a citizens' assembly around the reuse of data in New York during COVID-19, which showed that the public is very sophisticated with regard to those topics. And we need to do more of that kind of engagement to determine the conditions. And then last but not least, just to emphasize, we actually need funding to keep this all going. And this is about public goods, what we are talking about. And we all know that public goods are extremely hard to fund, but we do need to have public funding for those public goods. And I think that's really important to emphasize, that we can talk anyway the whole rest of the afternoon, but if we don't have a commitment, a financial commitment for a public good, like the reuse of public data, it's going to be very hard to do this in a systematic way. So these are just a few top level reactions, Hannah, and sorry for being long-winded as always.
No, please, much appreciated. And there's another question in the chat that I'll pass along to Amy and Stephanie, which is, to what extent do any of you think that the Privacy Act has been a barrier to government data sharing? Is the NSDS sufficient to addressing any barriers? And if not, what else is needed?
I'll take a swing at that. We did hear about the barriers that I mentioned earlier, which were about system of records known as privacy impact assessments, and this confusion about when data are being queried by direct identifier or when they're being accessed in an encrypted form, I think is something that needs to be sorted out. And that gets into a really wonky space where you need technologists and IT security specialists and the lawyers to get on the same page. But right now, they each have their own regional dialect. They're not quite speaking to each other, but they are speaking about the same topic, which is incredibly dangerous. So that is something that we have seen that as a bit of a barrier. I would note that in the federal evidence building space, the Census Bureau has been a hub of data linkage activity because they have one of the 12 exceptions to the Privacy Act. So they are able to use the data regardless for which the purpose it was collected, which is something Stefaan was just mentioning, that when we're talking about the reuse of data, it's because it was collected for one thing, but we're using it for something else. You know, and Hannah, you used the benign example of driver's licenses, but the last administration wanted to use driver's license data to exclude undocumented individuals from the apportionment count. So there are some reuses of driver's license data that we might be like, yeah, that's good. And there are some that might give us a bit more heartburn. So yeah, we do have a bit more unpacking to do with the Privacy Act. The NSDS is going to help on that. And I wanted to give Stefaan a shout out with the ties to the learning agendas and the Evidence Act. One of the recommendations in the Evidence FACA report, it's actually recommendation 3.4, is that there should be a staff of data concierges that start to support the important work that the data stewards do, like you were just saying. And there are also a couple of other recommendations in that report that I would point people to, 1.8 and 1.9, where we're coming out in the report saying, you need a model of shared responsibility. Privacy protection is not binary. It's not on or off. There is a continuum, and you need that steward to be trained and empowered to determine what appropriate uses can be. It's in parallel to what an IRB, an institutional review board, is doing. But the data steward really, they need new frameworks for looking at these privacy risk assessments, and also determining sanctions for unauthorized access, which is something that I think also is in the Q&A right now. If you have these DUAs and you have these license agreements, how are you then able to monitor? Like, what should you be looking for? And tagging on to what Stefaan was saying, that needs to be professionalized, that needs to be routinized, that needs to be automated to a greater extent, because right now it is pretty difficult to understand whether you've got bad actors. But I know I jumped around to a bunch of the questions, but.
No, you said what I was in the process of typing into that question box. So thank you for preempting me. You said it better than I would have. Another question I do want to get to just before we, since we're a bit short on time, is we've all sort of mentioned this a little bit in passing and talking around it, but one of the things that CDT has been thinking a lot about is the kind of equity considerations, the role of equity in this space. I'd just love for any of you to talk about what role do you think equity should play in these conversations about releasing data publicly in the actual public release, all of that sort of stuff.
I can take a first stab at it.
Yes.
I'll be quick. So I think on the privacy preserving technologies front, with some of the modern techniques Amy and I were talking about, it's important to think about who's going into, for example, secure multi-party computation. If you're using social security numbers to link across two disparate agencies' data sets, what about undocumented immigrants? You know, people who may not have social security numbers, can you use like a fuzzy linkage instead with date of birth and name or something like that? Also, you want to think about protecting already vulnerable groups whenever you're releasing data. And that could be, you know, just through community engagement, like we talked about previously, to let them know, hey, we're thinking about this additional use of your data. What would you like to see from a public release of your data? What kind of use cases? And then another issue with something to think about in terms of equity and PPTs, especially where like noise infusion, differential privacy, synthetic data is concerned. In education, for example, it's mandatory to report student outcomes and student performance by groups, by race, ethnicity, gender, etc. But some districts and institutions are running up against issues of re-identification where the number is too small. And it could, you know, potentially compromise the identity of individuals. So how do you find that balance is something that's like active conversations and must be thought about.
If I may, I would just emphasize that it's a crucial principle that we need to embed in all the principles with regard to data handling, and it's really important to expand the principles of data handling and have equity as being a principle that guides the way we go about managing data, the way we go about analyzing data and using data, and it starts from the beginning, from the data lifecycle, which means that we actually also need to have equity in what questions are being asked for which we have data. And so there's a lot of focus on data equity, but not enough, from my point of view, on questions equity. Who actually formulates the questions for which we collect data? Who formulates the questions that we seek to analyze? And I think that's quite often where we have already inequities with regard to power asymmetries on how those questions are formulated. And so one concept that we are developing is this notion of digital self-determination, which is really trying to operationalize equity across the data lifecycle. And happy to share some of that information as well. But I think very important question, very important principle that we need to actually operationalize across the data lifecycle.
Thank you, Stefaan. Amy, anything you want to add to that in our final moment?
No, we should do all of these things, and we should have money to do them all.
Yes, fully agreed. We are at time, and thank you. I want to say a big thank you to all of our panelists for joining us and for sharing their thoughts on this work. And of course, a big thank you to our attendees for joining us as well. If any of you had to step in and out or just want to share this with anybody else after the fact, this will be preserved on YouTube and on the CDT webpage, so it will be there for you all to access should you choose later on. And with that, thank you all so much and have a great day.